Okay.
Yay.
Okay, so some of this I will kind of just be reading straight off the slides just because I'm not the creator. So, and are the can you read them okay? Is it pretty visible? Okay.
Yeah, it's very nice.
Okay, great. So last week we were talking particularly about discovery, the discovery of the magical world, and then for us, what it means to discover faith in God. We talked about general natural revelation, so learning about God through history, nature, and human nature, and then special revelation, learning about God from Israelite history, the Bible, the church community, and our faith. And then we pulled this quote, which we'll review. The greatest magic is sharing a special story, falling so deeply into a world that someone else built, that the world you actually inhabit transforms around you, and then realizing when you look around that other people are experiencing that transformation too. And then we wanted to Anna really wanted to make sure that we were able to kind of document some of the side things that we were talking about. And one of them was the Harry Potter and Tom Riddle childhood. Jeremy, you sent me a very exciting text in the middle of the week. Did you want to share any more of your exploration?
Oh, I have it on the other computer. No, that's okay. I was just curious because my initial thought was, well, both Tom and Harry were orphans. In a sense, they both should have kind of, maybe there's some potential for them to have kind of common backgrounds there. But then I got off the call and started thinking for about 2 seconds, and no, Harry and Tom's upbringings were very different, and led them on different paths. And so I kind of was playing around with I just put a table together, 2-column table, Tom versus Harry. It's like I said, it's on the other computer, but it just, there are just lots of little things, a lot of little differences, I think, that made a big difference in the paths that they took. And, for example, Harry lived with his mom and dad for a year before they died. And so he grew up in that love. And whereas Tom's mom died in childbirth and he never knew his dad, if I remember Half-Blood Prince right, and went to the orphanage right away. And of course, and even though Harry lived with the Dursleys, he still got 3 squares a day for the most part, and could, had a roof over his head and some structure and school and things like that. Whereas Tom's, life was different in the orphanage. So anyway, there are just, I think, some differences there, and I haven't done a full analysis, and I could write a white paper and bother people with that, but.
That's great.
But I guess the greater point is, I guess, in my mind is, there were small differences early on that make big differences later on.
Yep. That's good. That's great. That I like that you kind of found some additional connectivity here. So
yeah.
Trying to make sure. Here we go. Okay. All right. Very good. So let me pull that back up. It's very hard to have the PowerPoint open and then have Zoom open. So I now respect my teachers more who stumble through this. I'm like super stuck now.
It's harder than it looks. I've tried sharing my screen, and the first time it did not go well.
There we go. Okay, all right. Yeah, for my college class, this teacher was like super not expecting to be teaching 22 people online for all of the hours that she is, and she is, oh boy, it is super interesting. But so I tease her in my head a lot, but now I feel silly. Okay. All right, so this week we're going to be looking at, well, actually, you know what, before we, so in Chamber of Secrets, what kinds of themes come to mind? We talked about it a little bit, I think, before we closed, and then in our video this week, but were themes or were things coming to mind for any of you that you wanted to mention or that you kind of think about when you think about the Chamber of Secrets?
The 2-headed dog. The lot of the Forbidden Forest, Hagrid. Sorry, I'm just yelling out things I remember from the story.
Yeah.
Because there was a lot of Hagrid had a lot to do with this story.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And wasn't this the, sorry, but it's been a long time. Wasn't this the book where they thought that Hagrid had opened?
Mm-hmm.
And so they had to wrestle with the fact that Hagrid may not be who they thought Hagrid was.
Yeah.
And he ended up, I mean, I don't want to, obviously I'm going to ruin it for everyone. You know, he ended up being innocent, but he kind of took the fall because he was different.
Yeah, that's actually, as you were saying that, I was like, that's actually another layer maybe to some of the things we're going to talk about today. So something to keep in mind with that. Good. Well done, Michelle. Well done. So this book is one of the books that I feel like I have reread the least. And I don't know exactly why. But it was hard kind of when I was reflecting on this one to remember a lot outside of the little things. And then when Anna was talking to me about it, things started to come back to me. So for some reason, if I were to rank the books, this one was lower on my favorites. I don't know. It's not relevant to the conversation necessarily, but
Yeah.
just, I guess I'm kind of curious, since we are talking about them with people who have read them, is this a favorite of people's, or how does this fall in your books that you enjoy or you look forward to?
I have
Of the
found
series?
Of the series, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, but I am like really enjoying rereading them because now that I know more about what's going to happen, I notice a lot of details that I didn't notice definitely the first time. But even when I read them to the kids, which would have been my second time, and I saw the movies, like, so the third time around, I'm finally reading about details that I think are really, really interesting in terms of themes and repeating sort of story plots, or like, I don't know how to say it, but
yeah, no, that makes sense. Once you know the end, it's easier to kind of find those little nuggets that she's leaving from the beginning.
Yeah. Well, and I saw something on YouTube earlier this week. Really hit, everybody thinks of Harry Potter as a fantasy series. It's really a mystery story wrapped up in a fantasy kind of thing. And so the fun of it, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, is uncovering those mysteries. And once you know what the mystery is, just to echo Laura's point, it's kind of fun to go, oh, there's where that clue was. Oh, okay. Because she's clues everywhere. Totally doesn't draw attention to them. It's like, oh yeah, she was doing that on page 5.
Yeah,
so, it's fun.
Like, especially how, like, really this book is super important to the end because of the diary and stuff.
Yep.
Yeah.
Come here.
But my favorite.
Yeah, there's
book
so much that you learn
the,
about Tom in this one. That's why I kind of like it.
Yeah. This is one of my favorites. My favorite is the Half-Blood Prince, just because you spend all the time in the Pensieve and seeing all those memories about Tom and
yeah. Oh boy. Okay. Oliver, do you want to say hi real quick? No. Can you say hi? Hi. Who do you have?
Hi, Oliver.
Are you writing Scooby-Doo? Okay. So that's what's going on. So if you're wondering what I look off to, it's probably because the dog is trying to potentially help the Scooby-Doo dog. So, okay. So this is so you guys kind of touched on some of the things that we were looking at a little bit in this, but we're going to be using Connie Neal, who wrote The Gospel According to Harry Potter. She talks about 3 different types of enslavement that happen in this book. Harry being enslaved by the Dursleys, Dobby by the Malfoys, and Ginny by Tom Riddle. We're also going to look a little bit at prejudice and bigotry based on heritage. Historical biblical justifications for slavery versus the historical biblical defense for liberation. And we're going to look at a couple articles that go with that. Sorry.
Mommy, wake up!
And then,
Mommy,
so in particular, we're going to be looking at this article which says Muggles, Mudbloods, half-bloods and purebloods have real-world parallels. So as we just look at that sentence, muggles, mudbloods, half-bloods, and purebloods have real-world parallels. When I say those words, what comes to mind when you think of a real-world tie to any of those?
Well, this is not a very Christian thing to say, but I always think of my in-laws as being muggles.
Okay.
Sorry.
No?
People who have no clue.
There's just not one iota of magical thinking in any of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah.
That's a good tie. Yeah, that's great. Okay. Any other, Michelle, does anything from our conversation on Sunday come to mind?
Yeah, like we think of purebloods as more the ruling class, the hierarchy that makes the laws and decisions, and then mudbloods would be those that, well, you can't expect those mudbloods to succeed because they don't have any real wizarding skill, or so those would be the least of these would be the mudbloods in the wizarding world.
Yes.
And I think even mudbloods would, even based on Malfoy's conflict with Hermione, it seems like mudbloods would even be below muggles, because at least muggles don't, like kind of like mudbloods pretend that they know magic, but they can't really, you know what I mean? Whereas muggles are just clueless, and it's okay because they're clueless.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, I think so. If anybody else wants to add, or
I'm born.
you want a bottle already?
Yeah,
Sorry.
Okay, it totally makes sense because you're trying to do something else, Dad.
Yeah.
We have
Totally
all
get it.
What is it that you want? Can you tell them? Oh, Binky in a bottle?
Yeah.
Are you ready for sleep already?
No.
No.
I'm ready for Binky in a bottle.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, all right. This is going to be, so I'm going to read a couple longer quotes from this book that we are using as a secondary source. Hopefully it's clear on your screen and stuff too, just because reading it, expecting you to remember it is silly. So, so Connie Neal says, the theme of freedom for those who are enslaved and oppressed. The book starts, and it's talking about Chamber of Secrets. Chamber of Secrets starts with Harry being forced to pretend that he does not even exist, then being imprisoned in his own bedroom by the Dursleys. Throughout the book, we see the suffering of Dobby, the house elf, as a perpetual slave to the House of Malfoy, from generation to generation, and how Dobby is finally freed by Harry's act of redemption. We also see how Ginny is taken captive by Tom Riddle. She becomes enslaved within that relationship, falls under his influence, and becomes a slave to her own sins and the secrecy created by trying to cover up what she has done. In all these ways, we see the dangers and destructiveness of oppression countered with the efforts of others to set the captives free and eradicate oppression wherever it is opposed. So when we talk about oppression and about liberation, what do you think of when you think about that, and as it relates to the church or as it relates to our faith?
Our church or the gospel?
Sure. Well, yeah, you can talk about the Bible too if you want. That's fair. Don't leave that thing out. Our church, our faith, the or the gospel or the Bible. Yeah. Is this an important element based on what we believe as Christians and based on what the Bible teaches?
Yeah.
Good. We're on the same page there. Can we all agree that this is a pretty important component? All right. Good. Okay. So now I forgot. There was.
I was just going to say.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, and of course we have our church meeting, maybe not necessarily First Pres. I don't know the full history, but the history of the Christian church itself. It's along with society has kind of a very mixed past with all of that, of course, and
Yes, agreed.
Participates in the oppression of some and preaches redemption for others. And anyway, we all know that history.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. So when you hear this read about this text that we're talking about, does this surprise you, or is this something? I mean, obviously, maybe not obviously. Maybe you have thought about it this deeply, where you're tying it all together. But is this a theme or something that you've considered when reading this text before?
I don't think consciously I ever did.
Yeah.
I've certainly never strung the themes together of Ginny and Harry and Dobby being enslaved, or but definitely, I mean, part of the whole appeal of the book is that we root for the underdog, or the whole series, and so that's kind of, I'm always drawn to that kind of a storyline.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I always really loved the Hermione's take on Dobby and the freeing of the house elves, and everybody's looking at her like she's completely lost her mind. And she's like, no, this is not the way that it should, and she's like trying to educate everyone around her about why this is a terrible idea. And they're like, but how are we going to survive if we don't have, our house elves and
yeah, and it's kind of interesting because if I remember right, when she gets kind of further into that, there's like the book. It seems like J.K. Rowling does a pretty good job of like kind of giving the other side too, where she says, okay, well, kind of like you mentioned, how are we supposed to survive? This is how our culture has existed, and things like that. And I think that's a really important part of these stories, because they give us that reality of like, okay, we're not just reading about heroes who are existing in a vacuum of time and space. They're actually, the decisions and things like that have an impact on the real world. So, okay, so we're gonna look at. So when we talk about these three different types of enslavement, I think they're kind of different. So when we talk about Harry and the Dursleys in the beginning, and this is going to be probably different for everybody because it's fresher in some people's minds who have read it more recently. But when you think about Harry and the Dursleys, how would you categorize, or how would you talk about that type of relationship? And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to use the word slave necessarily, but how would you categorize that in terms of like an oppressor type of relationship? I can give you an example if that would be helpful. So
I mean, everything about the relationship. Go ahead, Jeremy.
No, you go ahead. I'm good.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say probably about what you're about to say, which was they've had a long history of I suppose there's no other word other than abuse. And of course you factor in all the bullying on top of that Dudley did, at school, out in the neighborhood, what have you. I guess I never really kind of thought about what they were doing as slavery. I can see where you get that, or where we can come to that conclusion. But then also the time before this story, the summer, there's also now this new element of fear of Harry, having wizarding powers, and they don't know yet that he can't do magic outside of school.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, now that I'm reading it again, I don't really understand why Harry stayed as long as he did.
I didn't read it as slavery either. I just complete resentment, and they just after he came back and they found out he was a wizard, there was just this complete lack of trust and this fear that Harry was going to retaliate for all of the horrible way they had treated him all those years. And I feel really bad for oh, I forgot what her name is. The Aunt Petunia.
Petunia?
Right?
Yeah.
Petunia, that's it. You know, because even Vernon, he's even not kind to Petunia. I mean, their relationship is also a little along those lines as well, because he blames her for Harry even being there. Well, if it weren't for your sister, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well,
Well, that's kind of one of the interesting things. I think it's in the Deathly Hollows where we start to get into Petunia a little bit and growing up. And I think it's in the Deathly Hollows where we learn that a lot of her resentment may be from, jealousy or envy of, not being a witch herself. And therefore she makes it weird in her mind because she's not one. And then I've always wondered, how conflicted was she, in raising Harry? Was there something in her telling her this, this is my sister's daughter or sister's son still, and we need to be doing better, and she just didn't feel comfortable doing that with Vernon around. Again, kind of trying to read between the lines.
Yeah, even those relationships kind of get a redemptive ending. Yeah. Which I think kind of goes to your point, where it does seem like we get a little bit more insight into how she has some different feelings than what she portrays. And I think that I hear you on like the idea that we need to, using the word slavery obviously brings things to mind for us. So when we talk about some of these, we might be talking more about a power dynamic that leads to something similar to that could come from abuse or from entrapment, something like that. So if it's easier, we don't necessarily have to refer to it as that, because I hear what you're saying. It's not what we think of or what I think of when I think of the immediate definition. I think that there's definitely some abuse, and I think a lot of it stems from the fear of the unknown, kind of like what you mentioned, Michelle, about Hagrid, where it's a lot easier to blame the person who is different and who might have a power over you because of that. And Hagrid was different because he was also very large. So there was an additional fear component that went with him too, I would think. But yeah, I think that's a really great kind of overarching understanding of that relationship, that there was definitely a lot of components that put Harry and the Dursleys kind of in a tense relationship. I want to actually, before we talk about Dobby and the Malfoys, I want to talk about Ginny and Tom, because that was the other one that was more of kind of a, like a special revelation, I guess, to use that language, that I have on reviewing this. What do you think about the idea, just in general, of Ginny and Tom having a relationship, even though it was basically her, well, I mean, it was just her writing in a diary and getting a part of Voldemort's soul responding to her, essentially, so, as we find out later.
Well, having two daughters.
Go ahead, Laura.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll go this time. I was just gonna say, having two daughters who are teenagers and reading it now, I read it differently. So, when it comes out that she has been writing in it because she has all these fears and insecurities, and she's the new person, she's the first year, and she's got this crush, and her brothers are making fun of her, and I just could so more easily understand why she would get involved with the diary to begin with. Like, before, I wasn't quite tuned into that, but now understanding a little bit more about how those brains work and malfunction sometimes, it makes a lot more sense.
Sure, that's a great perspective.
Well, and to piggyback off of that, one of the things for Ron throughout the book is him coming out of the shadows of his older brothers and later Harry and Hermione. And I just imagine in the Weasley family what that's like for Ginny, being the youngest child and having to overcome all of those shadows and and being the odd person out because, you know, she's not another brother.
Yeah. And this is something that makes her special and stand out because that's what she's being told by it, which is probably exactly what she wants to hear. So,
yeah.
And I feel like a lot of young women and women in general get taken in by that kind of manipulation.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yep.
Just a hearty amen to that. Yeah. So, do you think that this relationship, can you, whether we say enslavement or we say some sort of
power imbalance?
Yeah. Do you see that happening? I guess you do, because you kind of
in the real world, yeah, absolutely. I see Jenny and Tom's relationship being that of an abusive boyfriend. Or it doesn't even have to be a boyfriend, but typically I think of boyfriend when I think of those kind of relationships. You know, one person who doesn't want the other person to be around anyone else, and it's going to give them all of the say all of the things so that they can control them in what they do.
Yeah. A diet of her deepest fears. Like, wow. Yep. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the one that I think is the most relatable to the word itself, slavery, as we understand it. Dobby and the Malfoys, or house elves. We get a lot of, she's so great at telling us like exposition about the world in a way that's like just super interesting, because that, like, we don't have to know anything about house elves, and she like very specifically chose to put this in, and not only that, but give us like really rich history. So we learn not only how house elves are and why they're, or like the fact that they're basically slaves to families, but we also find this like weird way out, this weird way they can be redeemed, and it's by being given dignity, basically by being given clothing. So what, you know, we're going to talk about this one a little bit more as we go into it. If anybody has anything they want to share thoughts on it right now, you can, but if not, we can kind of keep pushing, because there's some more we're going to talk to specifically about this. But
the only thing I'll say is that I find it really interesting, because the house elves, if I remember later on in the series, are revealed to have really pretty significant power.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting how they become enslaved. So, and I can't remember if that history's ever revealed or whatnot, but sometimes I almost get the sense that, boy, they could have just decided not to do this, or maybe not, but they had significant power, at least, and it's interesting that they were entrapped.
Yeah, that's a great point. It is like, it makes that real world thing tie in my head so much differently too, because that's just such a, you know, the people who have been oppressed or have been enslaved by other cultures all have that spark. They all have that magic that gets suppressed for long enough that they might believe that they don't have it, maybe even, you know. But yeah, that's a great point. They end up like, or house elves save the day many times.
Many times.
Or you even think of, thinking, forward to, was the organization that Hermione created called Spew, or was that Ron's nickname for it? I can't remember.
I think that's what she called it.
But
that was it.
But the house elves were resisting, her efforts the whole time, because they wanted to maintain the status quo for whatever reason, which reminds me of the story then of the Israelites after, God, through Moses, frees them from the Egyptians. They keep on talking about, boy, wish we could go back and eat from the giant meat pots and all that kind of stuff. So anyway.
Good biblical tie, Jeremy. Well, you guys are teaching.
That was good, Jeremy.
Points.
That's a great point. Yeah. We should all choose houses, and then we can give points towards our houses for the house.
There are quizzes out there we can take.
That's a great, I didn't even really put that part fully together. I like that a lot. That there was those who resisted, and they really do fit the Israelites pretty well right there. Okay. If I do this screen, you can still see the slideshow, right?
Well, we can see it, but we can't read it.
Okay. Oh yeah, this looks like total nonsense. Okay. I just need to get you all, your wonderful faces, moved out of the way, because I can't. Okay. That's better. Okay. So so this is also coming from Connie Neal. So a secondary theme in the book is that it's not right to be prejudiced against others on the basis of their bloodline. One should discriminate in healthy sense of the word on the basis of what the person has chosen to become. So now we have some quotes from the book, and this is another kind of interesting piece where we have it revealed that this is a thing that exists at all, and then that sorry, I have to find the Easter Bunny video. Hold on.
So I have a question. Are mudblood and half-blood the same thing?
No, mudbloods were wizards born to because neither one of Hermione's parents had any magical ability. And so she would be a mudblood. But if I'm trying to think of an example in the story where there's a half-blood. Well, I guess Tom Riddle,
Voldemort is.
Voldemort, right? You know, if you look at his parent, his father was a wizard, right? And his mother was not, or I have it backwards.
No, his mom was the witch.
Was the witch. And his dad was not,
she bewitched him, yeah. Seamus Finnegan, I read this weekend, his mom was, and his dad wasn't, and his mom hadn't told them before they got married, so dad was surprised.
Who?
Yeah. Voldemort's
Seamus
parents.
Finnegan.
Oh, Finnegan.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because at the beginning of the first book, he was saying, "Yeah, I've got one. My mom's a wizard. My dad's not. Mom didn't tell Dad. Boy, was he surprised."
Oh, Seamus. Yeah. Okay, I got it.
So in these quotes here, we're just kind of talking about how bad. So there's just kind of the in crowd of the language, which is probably a pretty common experience in most cultures. Understand what by Malfoy calling Hermione a mudblood, it was saying a very bad thing, which we're gonna get into a little bit more in just a second too. But the dirty blood, common blood thing, I think it's always topical, especially in our country, because and some of this might be because I'm reading this book for our Jeremiah Justice Initiative about the indigenous peoples, but what you deem to be dirty or royal blood really depends on what kind of blood you have. Excuse me. So I think that's just kind of an interesting thing. Any other thoughts on this slide or the word mudblood, or any questions clarifying any of that?
When I read it the first time, when they talked about the dirty blood, and that made me think of, I don't know where this thought came from, if it was a book or a movie or something I had seen, but about people not understanding that African skin is darker and that they can't just wash that off. But that's what it made me think of. And that's probably terrible, but that's, to me, the dirty blood, unfortunately in society, that's, oh gosh, I thought it was my computer.
No, you're good. I'm sorry.
All of a sudden they went, oh no, I have it plugged in. I swear I do.
Sorry, I'm finicking. Yeah, that's a great point. And it's one of those things too, like in especially in the wizarding world, how do you know unless they tell you? Like, and that's kind of the Voldemort thing. And even wasn't like part of Hitler's family was Jewish or something? Is that, am I right about that? Like, there's a lot of examples of people who kind of hate the thing that they are but are not
came from.
Yeah.
So,
which I think goes back to that earlier slide where we were talking about fear, which goes back to Star Wars, which is another great theme. But fear leads to hate. Hate leads to anger. Anger leads to suffering. It's that whole thing. It all starts with fear being the path to the dark side.
Yeah, that's great. We might have to explore Star Wars next time.
Oh, darn.
Exact same group.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm not going to read this entire thing that's on the screen now. This is another quote about the history of Hogwarts, another bit of information that J.K. Rowling gave us without necessarily having to, just to really enrich the story and give us the depth of understanding to these side plots. And just the idea that they worked together for many years, and then Slytherin wanted to be more selective with who was admitted, and he disliked students of Muggle parentage, believing them to be untrustworthy, and then they had a disagreement, and Slytherin left school. And then he goes on to say, reliable historical sources tell us this much, but the honest facts have been obscured by the fanciful legend of the Chamber of Secrets. So when I read something like this now, because of kind of even from our conversation last week of like, what would this story be if we were reading the story written about Tom Riddle instead of Harry Potter?
Mm-hmm.
Is the reliable historical source telling us this, correct? Was it Slytherin and Gryffindor? Because it's very convenient that Gryffindor just happens to always be the heroes and Slytherin always is the, so I don't know.
Yeah, when I read this this time around, it made me want to have a whole backstory on Slytherin.
Yeah.
Yep.
If we can redeem Snape, we can redeem Slytherin.
Poor Snape.
Yeah.
So that just gives us a little bit more context on that, this idea of the true heir. I don't know. True heir is I guess the church believes in the true heir too, so it's kind of tricky, but when it's somebody else's true heir, it makes you squirm. So it's kind of interesting trying to put myself in somebody else's shoes kind of thing here. So, all right. So here, little bit about the N word. So this is kind of obviously not a direct parallel, so don't mistake this conversation for being that, but the illusion of the word mudblood and the response that it gets when it's talked about, the closest thing when we're talking about real world things is talking about this is kind of what we're looking at here. So
that's where my mind went to.
Yeah. Me too.
Okay. So this is from a magazine from tolerance.org, and this is just a little bit of background on it. I'm not going to read the word, but so essentially it began as a descriptor and then became intentionally derogatory, and then it's been appropriated and reappropriated by people of color, but there's still baggage tied to it. And then so all of this kind of to lay out there and say, when we see this, how similar is this to reading about that word, and like what the contempt that comes with Malfoy calling Hermione a mudblood?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are our parallels there, or is this a different track? And we aren't talking about something relatable, and that's fine too. But because when I hear Malfoy, a person who is of great privilege in the wizarding world, a pure blood, telling somebody like Hermione, who comes from no magical background, that he's saying this with about as much contempt, I think, as a person probably could.
Yep.
And I think
it's the way I read it.
yeah. And so why? It can be as obvious as you want it to be. So
Yeah.
It's been brought up to, going back to what Laura said about Star Wars, he's been taught to fear and to hate and to like those who don't come from his pure blood wizarding rule, which I found very interesting that she used a character and she gave him pale skin and yellow, white, blonde hair and what is it, piercing blue eyes. I don't remember what his eyes were, but you know what I mean? It just
he is Aryan, I think.
get the idea home.
Well, the other thing too is you pick it up. So I'm about halfway through the Chamber of Secrets here, so it's a little bit fresh in my mind. But there's that scene. I think this is when towards the beginning when Harry gets diverted through the Flute Network to Nocturne Alley, and he's overhearing Malfoy and his dad. Well, his dad is really kind of harping on Ron about how, you know, Harry and particularly Hermione are beating him and are you know, getting better scores and doing all those things. And so, you know, Malfoy is also feeling pressure to do better. And his dad's putting, you know, saying, not only are you not succeeding, but you're losing to him, you know, to somebody like Hermione. See, I can't say the word, so it's okay.
Yep. That's a great point. That's a great point.
Yeah.
I hadn't even kind of forgot about Nocturne Alley a little bit. It's like Harry literally was like shoved into like a pocket universe of the Wizarding world this entire book, kind of like just so much he's learning about there's so much we're exposed to here. And I think that fear thing is just such a heavy part of this. The idea that like this kid has been told his whole life, and this is one of the things too, it's like you hate Malfoy and stuff sometimes, but also like, gosh, he's just doing what he was raised to do. And he was told his whole life that he's the best because that's just how he is, because he was born that way. And then to have someone who has no lineage, no heritage, doing better than him would probably be the scariest, most anger-inducing thing ever, because that's something that he thought he was entitled to. So,
I think also we have a I don't know if we're born this way, if it's human nature or if it's our culture, but there's this culture of comparison. And one of my favorite quotes is, "Comparison is the thief of joy." And I think for someone like Malfoy, whose father is comparing him, you know, who's basically teaching him the only way that you're valuable is if you're better than. Insert here. It's a life of comparison, and there is no joy there.
Yeah. Wow. That's good. That's a good word. That's great. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Bible some. I promised you I would. Jeremy beat me to it already with the Exodus talk. So we're going to kind of stick with the theme of our reaffirmation classes before church, what feels like many moons ago, where we were Genesis and Exodus. This is a story from Genesis 9, the story of Noah, and this is kind of the part of the story of Noah that we don't talk about a lot. So I'm going to read this, but it is up on screen obviously too. So this is after the flood. They landed the ark and on the top of the mountain, and they were trying to establish their new Eden, their new kind of creation story basically was unfolding with this family and these animals repopulating. So the sons of Noah went out of the ark, or who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it on both their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, great way to say that, and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed by the Lord, my God, be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Okay. See how much time do we have? This is a really crazy passage. A lot's going on. There's like a lot of great podcasts. There's a lot of things you could listen to if you want to know more about what seeing the nakedness of his father mean, like what the implications of that are, because that's really important, but it's not super relevant to what we're talking about here. Essentially what we're talking about here is that something happened, whether it's he saw his father naked and that did not bring dignity to his relationship with his father. He was not honoring his father, and that caused him to sin, or something else happened that caused him to be cursed. But Noah cursed his son. Technically, he cursed his grandson because he cursed Canaan, not Ham, which is interesting too. But are you kind of familiar with this part of the story at least? Are we all kind of on? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Anybody have anything?
I've read it before and I've never understood it.
Yeah. It's wild, but go
I
ahead.
I stumbled into it while teaching 7th grade Bible study to Josh, and I think Alex Josh maybe was 8th grade, Alex was in 7th grade, and I'm reading this and like, oh, guys, what are you making? And nobody said
That
much,
would have been funny.
so that's okay.
Yeah.
So we read it,
Like,
and we should move on.
Yeah.
From a
Let's see what good.
biblical interest of like theme, I think it's very interesting that the second fall of man still happened with fruit, just like something.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
In the Hebrew, the word saw, in terms of saw the nakedness of his father, means to gaze upon. So there's some, you can read into that as much as you want to in terms of like what that means. But I think the culture in that time was super important to honor your father, which is why the other two brothers did not look at all. So it's possible that he was just making fun of his dad too. So anyway, sorry, this is like a super fascinating passage to me, so I will not pause on it any longer.
No.
So when Noah woke up, he cursed and blessed his sons. So this is kind of slave language starts showing up, basically, is what we're dealing with now. So Canaan and his descendants, the descendants of Ham, will be slaves to their brothers. And then we also know that these people were the only people who populated the earth. So we have this idea that there's a group of people through history who are cursed or ordained, or however you want to look at it, by God to be slaves to their kin. Are we on the same page there? Good. I mean, it's not great, but we understand. Okay. All right. So, okay. All right. So now we're going to do some history. Okay. So we have some images here. So Isidore of Sevilla lived from 560 to 636 and was the Archbishop of Sevilla or Seville. He created this map. You can see that the three sons of Noah were placed on geographical territories of the world. Japheth was Europe, Shem was Asia, and that's supposed to say Ham was in Africa. I don't have my cursor on this right now, but are you able to kind of see that-ish? It looks like they're on the outside of the map, kind of gesturing over the regions, and it's difficult to kind of see.
Oh, yeah.
But they're kind of, and then the winds, you can see the winds that are blowing underneath them as well. But an older map, but it represents, it's to establish this idea permeating through history. So what are you doing? Okay. So then, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the wrong thing. That does not work. Sorry. Technical. Okay. Not bad. So in the map, I was looking at the map that's colored. I should have been looking at the one to the left of what I just
Oh.
Sorry.
Okay.
So it literally says Africa, and then Europe, and then Asia. Okay. So now, do you see what I'm talking about? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. That map makes a lot more sense with that time period. So, okay. And then here in 1493, a map from Germany, we see Ham associated with the world south. So this is the same thing where the brothers are kind of hovering over these areas. And 1943, if you remember, something very important happened a year before that. and it rhymes with ocean blue, and that's when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So this is kind of the beginning of world exploration, but also the beginning of transport of all kinds of goods. So, which is kind of burying the lead. What might this thinking? What might thinking like this lead to? So, are we on the same page with the idea of slavery?
It led to the slave trade. I mean, Columbus's discovery of the New World led to slave trade, and then we got the I don't remember. I can see the page. I can't see the words. The Columbian. It's a triangle of how they brought goods and services where they went, and people, and we should probably call it goods and services. That it was pretty much people and then stuff.
So this is basically kind of this, what we're looking on this page, we're going to look at it a little bit more, but Anna really wanted to intentionally trace this back. So we were trying to look at this concept of bloodline and what distinguishes, because these three descendants of Noah had the same bloodline, right? It's such a specific thing that we're dealing with, and we're dealing with this in Harry Potter's story as well, that it's not just about being royal, it's about being very specifically exactly what the person in power or whatever wants you to be. And trying to pull from different eras to say, okay, how is this story, this curse, informing the way people believed things as Christianity became a religion of power throughout the world? So this is kind of some of her research, just trying to establish this understanding. So this idea that we're talking about right now, we can see from Spain, from Sevilla, and then also from Germany in parts of in history that were 1,000 years apart from each other. So that's where we're going to pull from. So now this is kind of where the meat of this is. I'm going to put all three of them up. So we're left to wrestle with this. And I think this is something that I wrestle with a lot in faith. If God, or if Noah cursed his grandson and his lineage and said, all of you will be slaves, did God make the is that, and the result ultimately ended up being in some ways the justification of the transatlantic slave trade? Is that perpetuated because people believe, leaders believe and use that as a way to advocate for it? Or is it because the legend itself is true? Or were the victims themselves ultimately, I don't know. I think as a church, hopefully we can eliminate the fact that the victims were not necessarily the problem. But but this is, I think, a really compelling side by side that Anna put together, finding images from Harry Potter books, kind of put alongside images that we're kind of talking about here. So we have the legend of the Chamber of Secrets waiting for the true heir, and then we have the brothers clothing Noah. So that idea. So are we as Christians, and as readers, are we necessarily saying that the legend is true and that Harry was the heir and he came and all of this happened? Is it the leaders? So we have Voldemort, or we have basically, it looks like people branding slaves. The leaders who are using a text or using a legend from the past to communicate their desires as leaders, and then we also have the victims, people who, just like you mentioned, Jeremy, there's a great argument made for the house elves as well. They had great power, but they were, for some reason, repressed in using it. So it doesn't really, because this is, I think, is kind of a chicken or an egg thing. So I don't know if there's going to be a specific answer, but I wanted to show all of these images and just kind of open up what you all are thinking with this. Hopefully I'm communicating.
Yeah, this is really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, who would have?
Go ahead.
Sorry, Jeremy. I think the leaders would have been perpetuating the legend. I mean, as we know,
Mhm.
history is written by those who win, the victors. And so clearly the victims are not going to perpetuate this legend. At least the house elves maybe, but
Yeah.
you don't want, yeah. Sorry, I lost what I was saying there. I got lost in the house elves track.
Yeah, the victims are
Jeremy.
not perpetuating that. That's a good point. Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah, it's just interesting. Of course, Lane, you and I have talked for probably the better part of 2 or 3 years now about the Bible Project.
Yes.
And their, it's a series of podcasts, and their big theme that they explore is the Bible as a narrative of a people and their relationship with God. And obviously the story of Noah is part of that narrative. I don't know. I guess where my mind goes is maybe that's where it started. And I don't know if that's, so I struggle with that a little bit, the idea of God sanctioning slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And probably this what's more and more exploration, but it wasn't. I think it's clear from reading the earlier chapters of Genesis that wasn't what he had in mind or the desired state. And so it's, is it and was it people imposing slavery and of course even back in this legend and kind of just twisting that story, being an oral story over years. Into saying, well, now God said it. Maybe Noah said it at first, and now God is sanctioning it over generations. I don't know. I'm rambling a little bit here. These are kind of tough concepts. They're concepts that I think I can at least gather in my mind, but I can't articulate out of my mouth. So I apologize.
No, I think you did a good job saying what you wanted to say, I think.
But it's a big thought that kind of needs to marinate a little bit before you can really give a good answer.
And the good news is later on in the Hebrew narrative, God is pulling back on the idea of slavery and really trying to make the Israelites distinguish themselves from the other cultures who practice slavery and instituting Jubilee and restrictions and kind of taking that society away.
Yeah. And I think we can kind of have both. I think there's some both and happening here in the way that I read this, because like you mentioned, Jeremy, I struggle to not read the Bible like a narrative about the people now because of the Bible Project. It has ruined any other reading in a good way. A good one. But when I read something like this, it's a part of a story, but it's not like, it's like reading, I don't know, I'm not going to, it's like reading Harry Potter and then choosing to focus on a very small side thing that happened between, like when Ron was making out with that girl all the time that were like, I can't remember, but like.
Laugh.
Yes, yeah. Like, if you read the entire book or the entire series of Harry Potter and was like, man, it's pretty messed up. And I was like, why? I was like, well, because he just made out with that girl the whole time. Like, what? That's your takeaway from this? I don't know if that's the correct allusion. That was just the first one that came to my mind. But the idea that like that was an important story to the narrative of the people, in the same way that the story of Slytherin and Gryffindor having that disagreement and this idea, this legend being built. But then that doesn't mean that that's what God, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the plan was, and that 2,000 years later, or well, longer than that, here we sit in 2020 and we're still talking about this because people have used a small thing to make a big thing. And I think that you can kind of see that with the heir of Slytherin too. It became this thing, like everybody wanted, once they understood the Chamber of Secrets was opening, everybody thought that it was them, like Malfoy, like there's all these families who said, well, shoot, this is me, this is obviously happening because I'm here and there's all these things happening. And but it doesn't necessarily it doesn't complete the story. And the story of Noah is not completed by Ham's descendants being enslaved forever. It's completed by him living, 950 years or whatever, and his family being what repopulates the earth. Whatever that means. But so I think that what we're looking at in some ways is we're looking at people who are willing to take part of a legend or part of a story that's a narrative to a specific thing and see what they can do to make it work for them, which is very human, I think, probably. And I know that I've done that before. So it's a lot easier to win arguments when I can take what somebody else said and say, well, yeah, but that's what I meant. And I think that's kind of what, because Voldemort is a compelling leader because he can control people. And he can do that by saying, you have nothing and you need me. But in reality, he's talking to people who have everything. I mean, you look later in the, I guess we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but later in the series, when you're looking at who the Death Eaters are and who his like inner circle is, they're like the highest up in society. And his argument to them basically is that you're nothing because people are letting all of the, like all these mudbloods and stuff are running around the schools now, and like, man, that's actually very topical, but that's kind of
very
what,
topical.
Yeah. So but that may not be, and we don't know because we don't know the story of Gryffindor and Slytherin to that extent. So that may not have been what ultimately led them to split, was that Slytherin wanted only, the purest of all to come in, or maybe he did, but because of that legend, leaders spent their time putting that into practice, and suddenly people became victimized by it. So,
and perpetuating the belief that somehow by being of pure blood that they are better than others.
Right. Because I'm from Europe, so I'm clearly a descendant of Jephath, not of Ham.
Right.
And that makes me a greater brother. Yeah. Any thoughts or additional questions or musings on this one? And I know this is like a really big thing, so I'm not trying to belittle it, but
yeah, like Michelle said, there's a lot to marinate on here.
Yeah. Do you understand kind of do you see the connection that we're trying to kind of make between the two, though?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the more that I think about it, the more I'm like, okay, we're talking about racism here in the United States, and we're talking about she's made these characters, the Death Eaters, and they wear hoods, and we can make that parallel with Ku Klux Klan wears hoods, and they,
sure,
are very much against people of African descent. So therefore, is that the parallel that she's writing about?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. I don't know enough about the UK's history with racism and all that. I assume they struggle with it too, but to what extent? And I've always kind of put on the Nazi Holocaust kind of veneer over top of all of this, just giving it a European.
Yeah.
And the references to Grindelwald and all that stuff in later books.
Yeah.
So yeah, it'd be interesting to know more about what the UK's history is with that.
Yeah. Well, I think kind of like I'm gonna mention Star Wars again, which just means that we have to continue to push this for the future. But and I wish I'm not going to do this justice because I have very smart people that I know that communicate these things better when they watch Star Wars. But essentially, each trilogy is kind of like speaking to a good and evil thing that's happening at that time, and that there's a heavy Nazi kind of vibe going with some of the Star Wars stuff as well. And I think that that trope is just so universal in our understanding of, this is a bad thing, that imagery and that language that like even just by, I can't remember who pointed out, describing the way Malfoy looked, immediately in my head says, oh, okay, I can kind of see what you're trying to say. And like, granted, I also look like that, but there's like, we are getting this clear picture without being told much about these things that tie to our history, which is why they're so interesting, and why, regardless of what the UK has in recent history of racism and stuff, whether we're tying it in our American history to the Ku Klux Klan or we're tying it in a world history to Nazi Germany, there's still this like big rooted theme of good versus evil. Harry Potter is very aggressive about the overarching theme is good versus evil. And the idea, I think too, that like Martin Luther King Jr. said, I'm going to botch this one too. The arc of justice is long, but it bends towards justice, something like that. Lord be
the arc of history bends towards justice or something.
Yes,
yeah, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, but that's kind of, and we're dealing with characters who are not perfect, which I think is cool because we have Jenny who falls into this very normal, very human desire to be desired and pours her heart into it. We have like all of these things that like Harry is a total jerk a lot of the time to all of his friends.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And it may not be his fault because he's not had a great childhood either, but we have to kind of, I think that's cool. We wrestle with these small details that are happening, just like we do in the Bible. We're like, gosh, David was a monster, but man, we talk about him a lot. And we have all of these just little things that, because the arc of the story is telling us this story of justice and redemption that's pointing us towards, but it makes us sit with these really human characters and say like, yeah, I'd probably write in that diary if it was affirming me and responding to me. I'd get that.
Yeah.
So yeah, very interesting. I just wanted to make sure that I'm communicating these things that Anna kind of put together well, because I think that they're really good. I just want to make sure that I'm not misinterpreting them. So
Yeah.
no, you don't need fruit cups. All right. Anyway, so this is another kind of interesting. There's a Psychology Today article that basically talks about readers of Harry Potter and the way that they look at the world. So the article kind of answers the question that we have, but does reading Harry Potter reduce prejudice? And we can make sure we share the link if you want to look at the whole article, but essentially a lot of the things that we've talked about in this meeting kind of point in this article to the idea that Harry becomes an ally to the disenfranchised. And that by seeing that modeling happen, children who read it or who have it read to them understand that to be a common core human thing to do, which I think it kind of is. I think, like you said, Lara, like rooting for the underdog is a kind of human. That's why we all make fun of people who are fans of sports teams that are always really good, because they're like the evil empire. Like that's just kind of you can't root for the Death Star. So so it's common, but also I think being able to connect these things to real world things puts our, and that's why I'm excited to be able, like we have the picture, like the art books that have been coming out, where they actually have like full art and all of the words from all of the Harry Potter books. We're buying them as they come out for Oliver, so we can start reading them to him. And I'm so excited to do it because I think that this article is really spot on. There's a emotional and a social aspect of this world that I don't think we can fully like quantify in terms of just how we can tie it to things that make us better. And it's similar to, we talk about, again, we're talking about themes in the Bible as well. We talk about redemption and big picture things, and we're going to get there with these books too, and kind of what those allusions and homages look like in this series. But just this idea of reducing prejudice is something that I think is very heavy in the gospel. Jesus has a lot of work to say, I'm going to go sit by the woman at the well, and I'm going to redeem this, and I'm going to talk to you about, all sorts of things. And that would be whole nother class if we wanted to look at all the ways that Jesus attacked oppression and tried to reduce prejudice. But I think that I think that we have kind of like, again, with like Star Wars, we have these tropes that are put in front of us. We have Voldemort and we have Darth Vader. So we have like this clear thing where we say, we understand, even though I guess in the end, Darth Vader's like kind of redeemed. And Voldemort is not really, but But like Hagrid mentioned in the first book, he's not human enough to die. So what we have is kind of a like a soulless robot thing, in terms of that there's not a lot of humanity left in him, which I think we could, have a conversation about murder and like some of those things and what that does to your, like what big things like that do to your soul or your heart towards God. But I just think it's very interesting. Just wanted to highlight the last paragraph, but throughout the Harry Potter series, children can put themselves in the shoes of outsiders and underdogs, like the Mudbloods, which allows readers to experience what racism and homophobia feel like on a visceral level. By having a firsthand experience of the intolerance and unfairness against fictional minority groups, researchers observed a reduction of prejudice against immigrants and gays in real-life scenarios. I just think that's amazing. And this research was done, I think it looks like 2015 is when this was published.
This link was sent in the in Anna's email, so.
Oh, okay.
We have it, yeah. I read it, yeah.
Okay.
It's a good one. It's very interesting. It was a very simple study, and it had really good results.
That's cool. I will admit I've read this before, but it's been a while, so I don't remember. Did they just literally kind of ask kids that read the books what they thought?
They did a quiz.
Okay.
They did a quiz. It was fifth graders, and they did a quiz about, I think it was about immigrants and their views towards immigrants. And then they spent 6 weeks having them read Harry Potter books, and then they did the quiz again, and their views became a lot more empathetic.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Cool. So I think this is kind of a good overarching thing to be looking at too. We look at big themes in here, and just the idea that we are reading something that is kind of, in some ways, trying to push us to put ourselves in the shoes of outsiders. And that's pretty clear early on that that's the case, because the language that Dursleys use about normal and abnormal and stuff kind of makes us see, oh, okay, we're not supposed to be the normal ones in this story. So I think, trying to lean into that as much as we can. So this is the caveat, kind of, there's no way to underestimate the real, true, and horrific past of the United States, slavery, and the Christians' role in that. So the comparison can be an oversimplification. This is some of Anna's wondering. So I wonder how legends like the stories of Noah and Hogwarts influence real life events even to this day. And then the question that I think is really important, and one of the things that kind of pushed Anna and I to want to do this series, is how might reading fantasy like Harry Potter help Christians define their faith? Drink your bottle.
Well, I've always thought fiction is kind of really a laboratory in a lot of ways. It allows us to experiment with thoughts and ideas and things like that you can't really experiment with in real life. And fantasy lets us experiment with these kinds of ideas in a safe way. Mm-hmm. It's a way that we can kind of see it and watch it be shaped, but we're still apart from it. And so we don't feel as threatened by it.
Yeah.
And we can empathize with the character as opposed to somebody telling me you're racist or whatever.
Right.
Walls go up and the conversation ends. So.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, there's all sorts of great fantasy. I guess I never thought until this series started that Harry Potter as a Christian series. And I didn't know if J.K. Rowling is a Christian or if these are just kind of common themes or not.
I don't believe that she's practicing. I believe that I'm trying to remember from something that I actually did research on a while ago. I believe that she has a very strong background in the church and in philosophy.
Okay.
So I think she understands very well, which is why some of the names and so many of the things have very clear meaning.
Okay.
So I don't think it's like Chronicles of Narnia necessarily in terms of like we are supposed to read this and know that Aslan is God, but like.
Yeah, this is allegory. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that I do think that there's some really intentional things put in there that we can connect with as Christians. So
Yeah.
And I guess I don't know how much to debate the author's full intent on it, but but I do think that I think she has a great grasp of it, because thematically there's a lot there.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of pages, so maybe it's just
a lot of pages. In my introduction to Harry Potter, the only reason I picked it up was because there was a very self-proclaimed Christian who was railing against this book about how it was, leading these children to hell because they're reading about this character with a scar on his forehead. And I just was so surprised by his conversation, and I just questioned it so much that I just had to read it. And so I don't know, my mindset going into it, I wasn't looking for Christian themes. I was just looking for, what is it about this book that is scaring you to the point that you're, like banning it? Like, why? I don't get it.
Yeah.
So,
what was it? I mean, what scared people?
It what he said that had to do with Revelations and the mark of the devil, right? Sorry, I've not read Revelations, I'll be quite honest. It's got sorry. Honesty.
You're in good company.
But it's supposed to have a mark on the forehead. The devil leaves a mark on some people, and so his, and then you have Harry Potter, and he's got this lightning scar, and he just saw that as, I don't know. I think he drank some interesting Kool-Aid and never got through it.
that is a interest but that's a deeper take than what because a lot of the things that I've read because I chased down this particular path of like Harry Potter and Christianity for a similar reason, because I heard a lot of people saying that it's not Christian because it's magic, and they didn't necessarily relate to that, which is next level reading of Revelation, but it dealt with just the idea of like, if you're summoning these powers, you are, but then one of the other books I read, and I don't remember exactly how, but it talked about the differences of magic, because there's magic in Chronicles of Narnia, there's magic in Lord of the Rings, which are both inarguably Christian texts that are written by Christian authors to convey a Christian message. There's this idea that those who are doing good are not summoning magic within them, but they're casting magic out of them. So, which I don't know. I think we're splitting hairs, and that's kind of where we're at. But we're not. But there's like this idea that this magic that they're talking about, it's not like bringing the devil into you or whatever, but it's actually like you're expelling something from you. So, just kind of interesting. But, Anna, I wanted to just share. Anna texted me from the other room. The word. What are you trying to do? The word Voldemort translates to the theft of death. So there's just, that's kind of like we're fighting against death in some ways, which kind of fits our Christian story too.
Yeah.
So I think, I think we're at time anyway, but I have a boy who's ready to.
Yeah.
So
always out of time.
So next week we talk about my favorite book of the series, Prisoner of Azkaban.
It's a fun one.
I read that book like just so many times, just like 20 probably times at least. So that one I'm excited about. We'll have a video up on Monday. We're still putting together exactly the theme. So if you have any thoughts that you want to share, feel free to email or text us or something like that. Okay, come here for a second. You say bye-bye.
I hope Anna feels better.
Yeah.
We'll pass that along. Can you say a prayer with our friends? Should we say a quick prayer? Okay, well, I'm going to. All right, we're going to close in prayer. Dear God, thank you for this group. Thank you for conversation. Thank you for being a God who fights injustice and fights oppression. Allow us to continue to go into our world and do those things, and meet back here safely. Be with all of our friends and family who are dealing with illness. And we give you thanks for first responders, those in medical profession, those janitorial professions, those delivery people, all the people who make our lives still possible. We just give you thanks for all those people. Be with us in this week in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Thank you, Lane.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you. Bye, everybody.
Session. Thank you.
Have a
Bye.
good one. You say bye-bye?
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.